Hello and welcome to the Cuyamonga Institute, our Q&A Conversation for Exploration series. I'm Paul Robert, the Executive Director and President of the Institute, and along with my wife, Laura Lee, the Director of Research, Education, and Outreach, we want to thank you for joining us today. The Cuyamonga Institute is an independent, nonprofit anthropological research organization committed to expanding consciousness through the ancient practice of ecstatic trance postures. It was the insightful work of our founder, anthropologist Dr. Felicitas Goodman. She searched for the oldest evidence available, which she discovered in the world's collection of prehistoric and indigenous artwork, and decoded selected artifacts as ritual instructions. There's tons of information on our website at cuyamongainstitute.com, but today, we're going to look at the near-death experience. Though details and descriptions may vary across cultures, the overall experience is remarkably similar. The sensation of floating up, viewing the scenes around one's unconscious body, spending time in a beautiful, otherworldly realm, meeting spiritual beings, beings of light, a loving presence of a creator, a god or goddess, encountering long-lost relatives and friends, recalling scenes from one's life, a sense of connectedness to all of creation, as well as a sense of overwhelming transcendent love. Finally, unreluctantly being called back away from this magical realm and back into one's own body. And the reports are that the experiences don't feel like a dream or a hallucination. It's often described as more real than this reality. And there's an after effect. Significant change afterwards. They tend to have trouble adjusting at first back into everyday life, and some decide on radical career life changes. And this is not limited to one segment of society or culture. The near-death experiences have been reported by children, adults, scientists, physicians, priests, ministers, from the religious to the atheist, and from countries around the world. Of course, there's some ongoing research looking at the history and the afterlife beliefs of indigenous cultures that may find that their belief systems originated in the near-death experience itself. So previous and ongoing studies continue at universities around the world to better understand and document this amazing chapter of the human experience. And Laura Lee, what do you want to add to by way of introduction?
I'm so pleased that research, it confers credibility to direct experience. Those are always occasions to celebrate. So here we are in the trenches of life and death. We may have our own experiences. I had one cut of the similar cloth. We may hear those of others. We hear the last words of loved ones as they cross over. And we have these curious episodes that we can only interpret as the signs and signals from our loved ones on the other side, in dreams and in waking life. I know our family has so many of those episodes, and so many of our audience has similar occurrences as well. So we're delighted to welcome our two guests today. Dr. Raymond Moody, his 1975 book, Life After Life, just changed the stage on this. He was one of the earliest to look at this phenomenon, the near-death experience, collect the stories, give it credibility, and he coined the term near-death experience. And his colleague and partner in writing, Lisa Smartt, with her Final Words project, taking linguistics and looking at the words of those crossing over and what it can tell us. So Lisa in North Carolina and Raymond in Florida, welcome. So good to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Your stories in this genre start with your own personal experiences. Raymond, we'll start with you. How did you get interested in this field?
Well, actually, I'm going to have to go back to when I was 7 years old to tell you the actual story.
Yeah.
And that is that I should say that my dad was kind of sarcastic about religion. He was a professional military officer and surgeon who had served in the Pacific Theater in World War II. And retrospectively, I figured out that experience had no doubt soured him on religion. So I just grew up insulated from that part of life. My interest was astronomy. and actually comedy too, but that's another story. But I was 7 years old. I determined that I was going to be an astronomer and a comedian. And I had an experience when I was 7 years old or 8 years old, which everybody listening to this has had. And that was looking through a telescope. I got to thinking, well, how big is this thing we're in, right?
This
And
cosmos.
so, yeah, that's right. And so obviously your mind goes out to the wall. Then you think, just a minute here, doesn't there have to be something else on the other side of a wall? But the other option seems to be that it goes on forever and ever, and that doesn't make sense either. And I remember that night very well. I mean, maybe I'd had that thought before, but it really impressed me. And thinking that night about consciousness and that I am conscious amidst all of this. Now, strangely, this was not an upsetting or any way threatening to me realization about this incomprehensibility, because my favorite authors at that period of my life was Lewis Carroll and Dr. Seuss and Edward Lear. And so I was just very, very interested in the concept of unintelligibility. That is, why are some things nonsensical and unintelligible? And far from being a distressing state of mind, to me, unintelligibility is actually, I mean, it's just a fascinating state of consciousness to be facing an unintelligible phenomenon or thought. So then I went on, and about the age of 12, I realized through my reading of Lewis Carroll and Dr. Seuss and other nonsense poets that I appreciated, that far from being a sort of vague and amorphous non-thing, nonsense had a very sophisticated structure, and I was very interested in the different types of nonsense. I could see that there were different types of unintelligibility. So at the age of 18, determined to be an astronomy major, I went to the University of Virginia, which had a good astronomy department. And I'd gotten interested in philosophy in high school. So one of the courses I took my first semester was philosophy. And they gave us the first thing we had to read in that course was Plato's Republic. And I remember, I could show you where on the page I decided that I'm going to be a philosophy major. And so I read through the Republic, and at the end, what the Republic is, it's really, the whole dramatic focus of it builds up to this experience of a warrior named who was believed dead on the battlefield, and who revived at his funeral and told the story of leaving his body and going through a passageway into another world. And so that was by then Plato was already my hero and still is, by the way. And so it was obvious to me that Plato took this seriously. And that was the first experience. What I realized at that point, the notion of an afterlife, seriously, up to that point, I had thought that the notion of an afterlife was just a joke that people made. My only contact with it was in the context of cartoons and that sort of thing. So the fact that Plato took this seriously was what woke me up to the question. And so I asked Professor Hammond about this story of the man who nearly died and came back. And so Professor Hammond said that these early Greek philosophers were intrigued by cases of people who had apparently died but revived and told these stories.
So here you have a historical reference Who's got the dog? Do
Oh
you?
my God, he's mine. I'm sorry about this.
Oh,
He's demented. And so
no
it's
worries.
really, it's terrible.
So,
That's fine.
Lisa, let's hear your story. And welcome.
Well, hi, hello there. Hello. Well, I've always loved language, and it was a way that my father and I connected. He was a poet, and part of the connection for me with unintelligibility is, poetry doesn't always make sense, but it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
In the same way that Lewis Carroll or a lot of nonsensical experiences and concepts make sense in a way that's deeper, more profound, and multi-layered. Much more profound than literal experience or language. So very early, I had that sense about language. And synchronistically, so I went to school at UC Berkeley in linguistics. That was my primary passion. But side by that, I always had an interest in consciousness and spirituality. And so when I was 17, I read Raymond's book, like so many people. I remember, lying on my bedroom floor with my mouth wide open and, in awe of what he was talking about. And then I, so I was telling them about something you've heard many times, how I was 17 and I read your book and was in awe of Life After Life and of the person who wrote it. I never thought I would be working with you, Raymond, at that time. And so basically, fast forward, when I was 52, my father died very quickly over a three-week period. He got a very serious infection and it moved very quickly. And I just sat at his bedside. And as I did, I just saw really fascinating changes in his language. And a piece of what happened is his language became very, very mythical and poetic. And generally, some of the people who were there, hospice, were just disregarding it, saying, oh, it's, the medication, it's this, or they were disregarding. But I thought it was beautiful and powerful and intriguing language. For example, one day my father said to me, there's so much so in sorrow. And, technically that is nonsense, right? There's so much so in sorrow. But those were the kinds of things he said as he was dying that really intrigued me. And so I just wrote down everything he said, or a lot of what he said. And so that was one track that was going on. And the other track, and I just realized this very minute, that the two tracks that were going on with my dad's language were like the two tracks of my life. One was this very powerful linguistic field. And then the other was this very strong spiritual field, which had been kind of the two tracks of my life since I was very young. Because suddenly my dad, who was a skeptic, PhD, very rational, started talking about angels in the room and talking about seeing people and characters in the room. So anyway, I'll go into much more depth about all this later, but when all this happened, I was blown away. I couldn't make sense of it. So the first thing I did is just trucked up the street to UC Berkeley, because my dad lived in Berkeley, and went to the department and said, hey, I want to read all the articles and books about the language of people as they die. And I'll never forget this. George Lakoff, who I have tremendous respect for, he's one of the experts in metaphor, looked at me like I was crazy. Like, you want to know about the language of people who are dying? And I said to him, but there's so much written about language acquisition. Why isn't there anything written about the other end of the spectrum? And he said, well, it just isn't. Nobody wants to fund people's last words, right? Because, that makes no sense. And I was like, no, there's something going on here. I know it. There's something going on. So I became a little obsessed. I became very obsessed, actually. And then I was at Temple about 2 months after my father died. And one of the congregants just asked how I was doing. And I said, well, I'm basically doing fine, but I'm kind of obsessed by this whole idea of people's final words. And there's something going on, because it was very magical. It felt like something was going on with consciousness, And then this friend said, or this, a co-congregant said, I'm going to be teaching a workshop with Raymond Moody. in a couple of weeks. Would you be interested in coming out? And I said, holy moly, and the rest is history.
I have to say, as an English major, the mythopoetic language is the language I'm most comfortable in. And we always say, in describing the work that we do here at the Cuyamonga Institute, that the mythopoetic or the mythic language is the only language that we can use to describe our experiences in ecstatic trance. But I always had felt that's because we'd lost the language to describe this. But maybe what I'm hearing you all say is that that is the language of spirit. That language between that realm and this realm is that language. Because one fascinating aspect, Raymond, is that you had just told us prior to starting that you were familiar with our founder, Felicitas Goodman, and had read her book on glossolalia. And she had said in that book that the ecstatic trance state, which is similar to ours and exact, that people enter into to speak in tongues, is temporarily overtaking their speech center. And then you get that linguistic cadence and that particular, across language, across religions, across cultures, trance state. Tell us about that observation.
Well, that was sort of how I came to all this, because when I read that story in Plato and the notion of an afterlife, my thought was that the notion of an afterlife is nonsense. But that never had a negative or derogatory sense to me. I mean, it was just I realized that this notion that people are so attached to is unintelligible. And that was more than anything else what intrigued me about it. And so went on, I wrote my doctoral dissertation in philosophy on actually the basic idea was unintelligibility, what makes things unintelligible. And very early in my being interviewing people with these near-death experiences, I realized that there is a distinct possibility of reformatting people's minds to think logically about nonsense in such a way that when subsequently they have a near-death experience, they will be able to overcome the ineffability problem. Like people say that, no matter how articulate they may be, they just can't describe it to you.
It is a space beyond words. Yeah.
Yeah. And I realized that, to make a long story short, that if you prepare people in advance with the logic of how to think about things unintelligible, then when they have a near-death experience subsequently, they will realize that the standard way of putting it in terms of a travel narrative is nonsense, because people say that it wasn't temporal, it wasn't spatial, and there are no words for it. But I got out of my body, I went through a tunnel into a light, I met my deceased relatives, returned to my body, and came back to life. That's a travel narrative. But if no time and no space, then a travel narrative doesn't make any sense. And that was really the insight that brought me this interest in this. And so I realized, eventually that somebody who learned my logic of nonsense would have a near-death experience, and then they would come back and be able to put it in different words. And it's happened once already. Some years ago, a distinguished sculptor and scientist who had taken one of my seminars on how to think about nonsense had a near-death experience, or several near-death experiences, and a terrible illness subsequently, and came back and made the remark. He said, Raymond, when I was in that other realm, my mind went back to the nonsense seminary that I'd had. And he said, I saw that what you said is true, and that is that you can't comprehend how that world is connected with this world unless you take the unintelligibility axis into account. And what this means is that we already have a lot of different stories of near-death experiences articulated through Aristotelian logic of literal language, which makes them a travel narrative. I think now in the not too distant future, we will have other cases of near-death experiences articulated not just through the literal lens of Aristotle's logic, but through an additional rational principles of how to think about nonsense.
Oh, it's like Nesker's crazy wisdom. There's so much of the
Yeah.
sages that wrap their words around what we could call crazy wisdom. The
That's right.
Zen
And so once you solve that problem, see, then you've got parallax. Like, how do you know it's 4.3 light years to Alpha Centauri? Well, initially, because when the Earth is here in its orbit, you measure the angle, then you wait 6 months later till it's here, and there's a minute difference. You can calculate the difference out there. So that's where I think this is headed, is that we now have a way to prepare our minds in advance so that we can articulate these experiences more. But this is not going to go over well with what I call the afterlife establishment.
What I
They're
am hearing you say is that we really need to expand our collective worldview. And once we do that, then this will fit nicely into that paradigm. It's our worldview that is lacking, not our language, not our experience, not the universe itself. It's our own comprehension of it that needs to expand.
Yeah,
David
Tony,
Hume said accurately, said, by the mere light of reason, it seems difficult to prove the immortality of the soul. Some new species of logic is needed for that purpose, and some new faculties of the mind, which may enable us to comprehend that logic. And now we have it. So I think there's a whole new era in the afterlife investigation, but the parapsychologists are not going to like this, because they want to use that word science. And this is in 2021, to be in the real world. The question of life after death is not a scientific question in 2021. It's a philosophical or conceptual question. But I think there are now ways to break through that. And I'm trying to do this.
May not like this, but I think that the general public will love this because we're the ones having these experiences. And we are going to spend some time a little later on opening up and hearing some of these experiences. I'm going to start with you because you've had so many. One of Paul's superpowers is that he has had so many experiences with his own parents departed and then mine, who adored him. And then my sister as well. So
I think Lisa also wanted to comment on the
we're going to
last.
throw it to Lisa right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Enough about
well, I just wanted to say, I saw a comment here from, is it Tony, about dismissing nonsense. And one of the things that I so deeply respect about Raymond is, basically he talks about this thing called, a nonsense taboo. That again, as I mentioned earlier, there are certain kinds of language and certain kinds of experiences that we all agree upon as being real or being, the real deal, and only because they're intelligible to a certain way of thinking and being. So one of the things I so admire about my friend and mentor and colleague here is that, years when he was in medical school and hearing patients who, who went to cardiac arrest and then came back and were resuscitated, everyone else was dismissing their language as nonsense. But Raymond, he already had a PhD in philosophy and unintelligibility and had this deep and profound respect for nonsense, and knew that nonsense was much a part of the human experience and human language. And Raymond was the first person I'd ever heard of to talk about typologies of nonsense. He actually wrote a book that talks about all the different types of nonsense. So when he was a medical student and heard these people talking about things that everyone dismissed as nonsense, he said, wait. And he actually began to listen. And when people said, I never felt as alive as when I was dead, he didn't walk away and go, oh my God, they really have, some kind of brain injury here, right? He instead was like, interesting. The unintelligibility is part of the human experience. And what is this telling us about what went on for these people, right? So I love the fact that Raymond, and if Raymond hadn't had the kind of respect that he did for unintelligibility, we probably wouldn't have a term called near-death experience. Would we, Raymond?
Well, that's right. I just, I think that I discovered when I was undergraduate student in philosophy, I realized that that there is a sort of fundamental cognitive flaw in Western thought, which stems from the fact that, number one, in reality, people love nonsense. Dr. Seuss's books, I hope you are all sitting down, have sold over 600 million copies. Who knows about Lewis Carroll or Edward Lear? And those of you who are old enough to remember doo-wop music, for example, sha-na-na-na-na-na, which is a sort of shaman song structure, actually bringing intelligible elements and juxtaposing them to nonsense syllables to create a joint effect, or nursery rhymes or playground rhymes, and or Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong and scat singing, which is nonsense syllables and so on, or in religion, glossolalia, which Dr. Goodman investigated too, which are combinations of nonsense syllables put together to avoid meaningful combinations or grammatical structures, which when you continue it for a while, it does take you into a rather phenomenal ecstatic state, as I have myself experienced. So I just think that this cognitive flaw has to do with the fact that, number one, people love nonsense, but number two, people hate the word nonsense. And so really the barrier of rational investigation of life after death is not really anymore a logical problem, since we have a logic of nonsense, but it's a psychological problem. And that certain kinds of people, just because I think of a kind of authoritarian personality or a pigheadedness, just are unable to get over their unfavorable emotional response to that word nonsense. And it's kind of an ambiguity. It's like people use it as a form of apodeoxis, which is dismissing something. But what the actual word means is language that is unintelligible due to lack of meaning. But the secondary application of it as a way of dismissing things, that's just a psychological barrier that I gather is too much for some to overcome. But in order to pursue the genuine rational investigation of an afterlife, it's necessary to overcome that psychological barrier. But once you do, then the question of an afterlife can become a genuine rational question. What I'm doing now is I'm not trying to sell a book, folks, but this is my book that Lisa mentioned, published about a year ago. It's the extension of my doctoral dissertation through many, many iterations. But the project I'm doing now is that I'm getting as many people to read this and to do the exercises that go along with it.
I'm signing up.
Anticipating that eventually there'll be enough people who know about how to think about nonsense, but then we'll have a near-death experience and I'll have a whole new way of talking about it. The basic problem is that most people regard, if this is the level of ordinary meaningful language, most people regard nonsense as something down here, as something sublinguistic. But that's not true. Once you think it through, you can see that actually nonsense is something superlinguistic. It's a layer of knowledge it's more articulated, or you have to go through a more complicated thought process to compute nonsense than you do to compute ordinary meaningful.
A shaman song. You mentioned repetition and metaphor. And really the aha experiences arrive when we put two unexpected things together and we find this leap of arc of energy between them, this leap of insight. And so there's some very rich turf there as well, and ancestrally that we've used this in inducing trance states or associated with trance state. And also when you're in the trance state, then it comes up. So you've put some science to this. Tell us what Andy Newberg, the neurologist, said about this, Lisa.
I want to know exactly. Let me see. Well, okay. I was trying to think where you're headed. Some of the work with Newberg was looking at people. He did brain scans. He's a neuroscientist and comes that way into looking at consciousness. And when I spoke to him about his discoveries with working with the states of enlightenment, and so he worked with monks and nuns and people who had very profound states of relaxation and prayer and meditation. There were the places that the regions of the brain that were activated seemed to be closely related to the places where that are activated when people are speaking nonsense or glossolalia. So there might be a connection between that. Now, we also know that consciousness is non-local. So, that's my perspective. But I think I kind of think of the brain as a receiver. So when we see these brain scans and stuff, it's not the perfect science like Newberg, my perspective, it's not the perfect science like Newberg might think of it, but I do still think there's a truth in it. So that consciousness can be non-local and we can still be informed by neuroscience in terms of where the receiver is finding, where the energy is appearing. Does that make sense?
The different centers of the brain are activated.
Centers of the brain. Yeah. So he's seeing places of activation when people are in deep states of meditation. There's kind of an overlap, the same regions when people are speaking nonsense, especially glossolalia. That was the research that he did. So when people are dying, you hear similar things when people are at the bedside of those who are dying, like, oh my God, what's wrong? The fear of nonsense. There's something wrong here, speaking nonsense, and people are afraid to deal with it. And yet my sense is that while we're seeing the destruction of parts of the brain, or what you think of destruction, right? Because, people are dying there. So technically they shouldn't be able to produce any kind of language or certain types of language. And yet sometimes we're seeing really sophisticated expressions, but they seem to reflect perhaps some kind of connection to another dimension or another way of thinking that might be connected to those regions of the brain that are closer to meditative states, right? Because if there's more and repetition, you see more repetition at end of life language. And that's very interesting, right? Because we know that repetition is one of those things you were talking about that's co-located with other types of language to create interesting states of being and expression.
Yeah. So you talk about metaphor, you talk about repetition and non-referential language. You've dissected this language. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes. Thanks again. Well, thank you, Raymond, for your inspiration with all of this with me. The non-referential language, I'm going to get some examples so I can be really as concrete. One of the things as my father was dying that he said was a few days before he died, he was talking actually to his secretary on the phone, or the woman who was his editor and secretary. And he said, Alice, this is very interesting. I've never done this before. And it was really, my ears perked up because I thought, what is the this he is talking about? And that's called non-referential because we don't know what he's referring to. I don't know if he's referring to dying, or I don't know. He was already talking about angels. So I was wondering what the heck is going on with my papa, my dad, the skeptic. What is that this? And so that non-referential language is really common as people are dying. So you might hear things like, lots of people have this, or it's not what you think, or my vocabulary did this to me, or too bad I cannot tell you all of this. So you hear these non-referential statements which leave you with a sense of incredible mystery to me.
Imagine what they're referring to, but we don't actually, because we're not seeing what they're seeing. They're on that travel log. They've got a foot in this world and a foot in that world, and they're explaining the crossover. And I'm wondering, Raymond, the stories that you hear of people coming back from death and reporting their experience, how does that correlate to the body of work of these final words that Lisa's been compiling? Are they not referencing the same thing, or what? Are they similar?
Well,
Or are they
I
different?
think so. I had already been studying near-death experiences for 10 years when I went to medical school. And so when I got on the wards, um, I began to notice that sick people talk nonsense. For example, people who are delirious talk nonsense, and people who are intoxicated with various substances with mercury, for example, like the Mad Hatter talk nonsense, or people who are under severe stress, even if they're not ill or injured, talk nonsense. And schizophrenics use um, nonsense words and so on. And so what I realized was that the types of nonsense that people talk involuntarily because they're ill were the same types of nonsense that Dr. Seuss and Lewis Carroll and others write deliberately. So in medical school, I had the realization that whether nonsense is deliberate or involuntary, it's nonsense. Nonsense is nonsense, whether deliberately or involuntarily. And so I had a lot of experience in medical school dealing with the terminally ill, and this phenomenon came to my attention that it was very common in the last few days of life for people to talk nonsense, but that what the people who are left behind would often make the comment that I knew he was talking nonsense, but somehow in the back of my mind, I kind of understood. So that was I guess that was the remark I made at that conference where I first met Lisa that she was intrigued by. And it makes sense to me, you see, that I think there's a simple argument to show that if the mind transitions from one sphere of reality to some other sphere of reality and then makes a return trip, they would have to talk nonsense to describe the experience. Let me give you an example.
Because
Everybody, I'm sure, knows the Escher drawings, right?
yeah.
MC Escher. My favorite one being of the water wheel. And you see the water going through the trough, flowing over the water wheel. Then the water goes into one trough, goes down one trough, then turns a right angle, goes down another trough, then turns another right angle, goes down another trough, then another right angle turns down another trough, and it's right back to where it started, right? So that's nonsense. However, if you took a protractor and a ruler and what graphic artists called a value scale, all the shades from the brightest white to the darkest black, then you could make an intelligible description of that surface with those instruments. You could say, well, this line here is 32 inches long, or 33 centimeters or whatever long, and it goes off from this line at a 43-degree angle or whatever. You could do that. You could make an intelligible description of the drawing, but to describe what is in the drawing, you have to talk nonsense. And so I think that's how the experience of transitioning from one state of reality to some other state of reality would necessarily, people would necessarily have to talk nonsense to make that description. So it was when I realized that stories of near-death experiences were, nonsensical, that to me was, that's what you would expect if they were real, right?
Well, we have to use Escher to describe sometimes our own trance experiences, because you go inward and you end up over here. That it's just the topography of the alternate reality is very much like that. Yeah.
That's right.
So built like an Escher drawing, it can feel like.
It is. And so,
Um,
reality is much weirder than we can imagine, I think.
Thank you, and much more expensive. Yeah. So, Lisa, did you want to add more about linguistics? And then I want to ask Paul about his own experiences and have you comment. Because I think, Paul, your experiences are so common to so many people. I don't have those experiences that you do, but you have had so many. Okay, first time I noticed this, early in our marriage, Paul is sitting there meditating, and I'm sitting next to him, and I sensed this bright light coming off him. I didn't see it, but I sensed it. My inner eyes picked it up. And I knew something profound was happening. I could feel the presence of his father who had recently died and who Paul did not get to go see in time. The nurses at the hospital said, no, he's fine. And we had a ticket, but Paul says, I think I should go. But the nurse says, no. He missed that. It was tragic for him. He could have been there at his father's bedside when he died. But so I'm feeling this beatific aura from you. And I knew what was happening. I don't know how I knew, I just knew. And so finally, after it faded and he opened his eyes, I said, that was your father, wasn't it? And he goes, yeah. And you had this profound experience of your father coming to you. You had tears running down your eyes, and you said, I got the closure I needed. And I knew. So that was one of the first. His sister died early. She's come to him in dreams. His mother, when she died, she came to him in dreams. They'd have long conversations. Paul was so close to my parents. It was his second set of parents. They called him their fifth child. They just adored him. My mother and father come to him, not to me. They come to him in his dreams. He'll wake up and he'll go, oh yeah, I had a long talk with Lester, and it'll be so profound and so real. I know this is common, that certain people just have this. Not my superpower, his. I have others. But this kind of experience, I know that this is also part of your turf, that you cover these types of experiences. But do you want to talk about, I didn't mean to tell your story for you. I apologize.
No, you do a much better job than I would telling my own story. But I think let's not put it in the category of super, but simply it's a normal experience that many of us have, and it should be, and it's accessible to all of us. And so
thank you.
I just have this ongoing fortunate experience of this communication where I lots of things are resolved, lots of questions, lots of answers, and life continues, which is the foundation of today's discussion, life after life. And there's that relationship. And today being a day that's Mother's Day, many of us that are at a certain age have our mothers who have passed over. We feel that presence. We know that it continues. So
and it's interesting that it's in dream states that it comes to you most often, or a deep meditation that you can fall into. Yeah. And so something about the waking dream hybrid state where you're awake in your dream, you're conscious to this, that can come through. How do you explain this? Go ahead, Lisa.
One thing I wanted to say, it is Mother's Day, and my mother is actually in the process of dying now. So I just want to send her my love and talk about, I think I might want to read a poem to her, if that's okay, if I could just use that, because it was a poem my father dictated to me right after he died. I heard him talking to me, and I had a very real experience of him, even though he had passed on 6 weeks earlier. And what surprised me in doing the final words work for myself and also with others, for the families who traveled closely and journaled with their loved ones as they were dying, they kept a journal, like a log, by the side of their loved one's bed as they were dying, and kept track of the language. Many of those people seemed to have more connection with their loved ones when the person died, because they were already sort of getting in rapport and having this, it was almost through being open to the nonsense and open to all the ways that their loved one was communicating. Then after that person passed on, they seemed to be more open to the ways that communication might be going on. And, I definitely feel my ability to connect with what I call spirit, or whatever you might want to call it, really increased through the Final Words Project. Because before I began the Final Words Project, it was something I was open to, but, didn't feel that real to me. And just somehow spending more time at the threshold seemed to kind of open the portal. And so if you all will indulge me, this is one of the poems. There were about 50 of them that came through from my father. And I really want to do this to honor my mother today, if that would be okay. But it's also what my father, so I was meditating one day and I just heard my dad say, I know your mom's grieving. Would you just write down these poems for her? And I'm like, sure. And there's this whole thing about suspending disbelief, and just, I think, so many times we can doubt the dreams or things that we hear. And my feeling when I heard my father was like, what have I got to lose to write this poem, right? I mean, it's called No Light Shines. Even in heaven, no light shines as brightly as Susan. The cosmos sing for you as the days pass, and I become the mountains with their longing for spring after long snowy winters. We are wed always, like boat to harbor, even as I sail out to this vast sea of galaxy. You're always mine, beloved Susan. And the poems call out to you beyond the seams of angels to your tattered tears. Do not cry too long. Let the laughter of your love illuminate the skies, for I will always hear you.
Wow.
Beautiful. Fabulous, Lisa.
Wow.
Wonderful.
You know, it's interesting how people getting close to death, you seem to enter that field where everything falls away but the love. And our father, Lester, would sit in his little wheelchair looking out at Lake Washington in Seattle. And he would hold our hands and he would say, "Isn't that beautiful?" And he would just, "Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that beautiful?" Hard-charging businessman, just so changed to become the Zen
last
master.
year of his
Everything
life.
was beautiful and expansive. Yeah, how beautiful.
Thank you.
But it's
Especially-
interesting that it just becomes love. It just becomes appreciation, that their field kind of expands with them, we've noticed.
And that language, I mean, if you give language permission, it's just incredible what kinds of things can emerge. And that's part of my passion around the Final Words Project. You know, for Raymond, it opened the door to the near-death experience, right? Because of his openness up to all kinds of language and to the exploration of the afterlife. And I felt for me, it did the same thing and helped me understand the tracks of consciousness, but it also helped me connect with my father in ways that probably would not have been possible had I not been on this inquiry during those weeks with him.
And why it's so important to be with them. We had the privilege of being with our parents those last couple months and just being there. Yeah, good tips about pay attention, show up, be interested. That's also what's opening the door, is your own interest, your own intention, your own honoring of the messages that come through. It seems that you open the conduit just that way alone, in addition to various other ways. So good tips. What other tips do you have to be open and, to facilitate this? Keep a journal.
Yeah, well, you know, it depends. There's our own experiences of our connection to whatever you may want to call it, the field. I mean, it's a mystery that I don't understand. But, and then there's the way to stay in rapport and connection with our loved ones as they die. And, you know, I was trained as a linguist, and that meant that all languages are right. Like I wouldn't say, oh, that's Chinese. I don't understand it, so it's not really a language.
Right.
I mean, those people, they make no sense. So that's not a language. Right? No, honestly, Chinese does not make sense to me. It is unintelligible to me, but it's a highly, highly organized and sensible language, of course. So anyway, I really invite people when they walk, sit next to their loved one to just assume that there is something that I don't know if meaning is quite the word, but there is something going on that is worthy of our time and our respect. So I ask and invite people to imagine that they are like in another country and just make notes of what they hear without any judgment. That, when you enter the room of someone who's dying, imagine it's a foreign language, and that you're very privileged to be at the bedside to listen rather than, oh my God, Dad's crazy. He doesn't know what he's talking about. It's the medications. Oh my God. Just to be open to what you hear. And, I was blown away. 3 days before my dad died, my dad, the skeptic, when he said, the angels have told me 3 more days, the angels say enough. And then, 3 days later, he passed on. He was seeing something, and I got to visit with him through his language and his experience. So anyway, one of them is just imagine you have just entered into another territory or another country, and be as open to it as you would be any other territory you would enter, and not disregard or disrespect what you see or hear there. There's
a connection to sound itself that seems to display itself in this scenario that we're talking about with nonsensical sounds. I worked with a musician to record some music who did vocables. She did these sounds that were always spontaneously, I guess what you would say is it's a channel for, a channeling sort of singing. But it was fantastic, the beauty that came out, and knowing the vocables, how she would move sounds into certain syllables and sounds. And we recorded over and over many songs with her.
After a week doing trance.
Yeah. Jane Elworthy from Australia. And so there's something about that as well that connects to
you
this.
can fall into a state, and then the vocals come through in a certain way. You're on a wavelength, and it has a expression and a cadence and a vibration.
Right.
Well, I had mentioned earlier that repetition is really similar, is really common at end of life. And we all know Steve Jobs, oh, wow, oh, wow, oh, wow. But, there is something about the repetitive thing which takes us away from language and more into just sheer music or vocalizing. And but that's...
on Mother's Day, but we were all there, all four of her kids, with a hospice round the clock. And my mother's passing. My mother was ready. She goes, "I'm ready, kids. This is miserable. I'm not having any fun anymore. I'm ready to go." We're like, "We're not ready to let you go." But all that time, they sent me home 2 days before she finally passed. They said, "You need to go be with Paul." Paul had been there, but Paul had to leave early. When your mother's passing, you want to be with your husband. We've got it covered. And my sister Kimberly was there, holding her hand and just being there. My mother would say things, Kim says, like, "I'm going on a trip." Travelogue, Raymond. "I'm going on a trip, honey. Can you pack my things?" And Kim would say, "Yes, Mom. I've packed your favorite hat and bag and your best outfit, and you look beautiful, and you're all ready to go." And then my mom said, apparently, "Who are all these people in the room? Who are all these people in the room?" And then she goes, "I'm getting ready to go. I'm getting ready to go." Peaceful, loving. So
classic. What you said is, I mean, not to diminish it in any way, but it's so common. And what's so great about any kind of research is, we have these experiences and we think we're unique, or that somehow they're bizarre or strange or something. And then when you start looking at samples, like I have now over 2,000 bits of language at the end of life, what you said is so classic. People start talking about the trip, start talking about the people in the room. And it's amazing, because then I've come to see the universality that there is something going on at the threshold beyond just those anecdotal one-on-one experiences, that there are amazing things going on at the bedsides of the dying. Truly.
Parenthetically, I would like to make a remark here about what you're hearing in the background. My dog Moses, who's named that because somebody threw him at the creek in our house, near a house we lived in, on Christmas morning. So it's just like somebody threw him away. He was a puppy. So that's why his name is Moses, right? We drew him from the creek. But what you're hearing there is exactly his kind of dying words. He's talking nonsense because he's very demented, and he doesn't. So I've given him couple of Benadryls today. He's doing this all the time now, but but it's, this is, I think we're in a very ironical period of investigation of the afterlife, because just many people are just not, they're just so turned off by the idea that life after death is unintelligible. They want to make it something intelligible, and without realizing that if you look at the history of science, the role of nonsense in science has been that of a placeholder. That is, it's what we hold on to, knowing that it's unintelligible, with the anticipation that eventually we'll make it make sense. And I guess the main example right now is the fact that the two most powerful explanatory systems of physics ever devised, the general theory of relativity and the quantum theory. But the difficulty is if you integrate those two sets of equations, what you get is unintelligible nonsense. So that shows how science is, and nonsense is a placeholder in science, and unintelligibility itself changes. If you'll all do the mental experiment for yourself to go back in your mind to the year 1915,
Okay.
and assume the mentality of a very well-educated, articulate person of the year 1915. And now listen to these three sentences. Sentence number one, all four of Ethel's grandparents perished and were lost in a shipwreck long before her mother and father were born. Unintelligible nonsense, right? Now, add the subsequent realization of the role of DNA in heredity, the development of gene transplants, cloning, gene engineering, and so on. And we can imagine a scenario. We send the probe down and get the DNA from the bones, and we clone, and we can have that scenario actualized. So it makes sense in 2021 where it was nonsense in 1915. Or listen to the following sentence, 1915, two women got married to each other at City Hall yesterday, nonsense. Now the law of the land. Or go back to 1915 and listen to this one. I watched a movie on my phone this morning. Unintelligibility, I mean, it's just thanks to my dear friend. I love Aristotle, but he's the one who fastened this on us. And the reason was that Plato, who first distinguished clearly between the literal and the figurative, also was working on how to think logically about nonsense. He did a whole dialogue on it, and he got a lot of the things right. He understood that nonsense makes people laugh, that even though nonsense doesn't make any sense, it nonetheless triggers a sort of mental process. He realized that one thing could be more nonsensical than the other. But when his pupil Aristotle tried codified logic, that was just a step too far for him. I mean, he was a very literal-minded guy in a way. His favorite word for nonsense was random talk. But actually, the fact is nonsense is less random than ordinary meaningful language. So, because of Aristotle's personal limitation, and I love this, not a criticism, I love Aristotle, but that was just one of his limitations, was he was literal-minded. And so because of Aristotle, we're unable to think logically about nonsense. But we can fix that. There's a patch available. It's like things that are very counterintuitive. Like people say, what is he talking about? Different types of nonsense. Well, listen to the following. Sentence number one, 'twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave.
I know
That's nonsense, right? But now listen to this. Holiness breeds the vestigial lipstick of sparkling spontaneity. That's nonsense too, but a different type. Now listen to this one. That cannibal you men just ate was the last one in this county. That's nonsense too. But you can realize that those are all nonsense, but they have different structures, right? And if I give you another sentence, you can tell which one of the three types it is. If I said to you, for example, when you do this experiment, if you smell an odorless gas that is carbon monoxide, and you realize that's an example of the third type I gave, right? Well, there's 70 plus other types, like hat thoroughly the if zooms house est, or whatever, just lots of different patterns. And once you realize the principles by which unintelligibility operates, then you can actually make major advances in areas of study that involve unintelligible things. And this is the fact, but it's not going to be received very well by people who just can't make that psychological leap to get over their aversion to the word nonsense.
Do you think that's built into them? Like, some of us are happy to make that leap. We're making those
I
leaps.
realize that. I'm I realize that people listening to this would realize, but I think you'll all also agree with me that for the average person, this is just too counterintuitive.
Lisa, go ahead.
Well, I mean, my experience, at least at the bedside of people who are dying, families and friends find it scary, really find nonsense frightening, and because oftentimes the way we connect with people is through shared and consensual experience, right? This is a cup and we all agree, and that's our way that we come together, right? In many ways. And nonsense has multiple meanings. And so everyone's experience is different. And I think that until people can find the common ground in the nonsense that they hear and they share, that it can be really frightening.
Oh, I've observed over the years that there's personality differences, like people of different kinds of personality structures have variable tolerance of nonsense. For example, people with authoritarian personalities are the most strenuous objectors to to the whole idea of taking nonsense seriously.
I like George Lakoff, who says, you referenced him earlier, that are you part of the authoritarian father? Then that is one political stance. Are you more of the nurturing mother? Then that leads you to another political stance. That kind of orientation deep in our psyche colors how we perceive the world and how we want the world to be. I remember as a child that we had some very interesting neighbors. A woman who just had second sight, and she would talk about a death in a family that she referenced when we were there visiting with her, and later it came to her, and later it happened to be true. So she got the signal before she got the information conventionally, right? She just knew. So I was there to witness that. So when those kinds of things happen, well, let me back up. So the very first radio guest that we had was she was a part of the IONS, the International Near-Death Experience out of Seattle,
Right.
which was the largest chapter.
Kimberly Clark, sure.
Kimberly
Clark.
Yeah.
Kimberly, oh, my own sister's name.
So let me
Kimberly Clark. Huge hit. Boy, did I pick a home run for a first guest to launch a career. Like, people called in. It lasted for hours, time after time. She was validating this. People were so fascinated by that.
That's true.
And then later on, Barbara Walters did a report. Finally, they catch up, like ABC, NBC, whatever news. No. The near-death experience is just the biochemical cascade that happens when you have death, and it's all an illusion. I'm like, it doesn't have to discount. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. Yes, there's a biochemical cascade that happens, but that could be the biochemical support that happens when you start to transition and your soul is leaving, or your soul is expanding, or your consciousness is expanding. We say that trance states are entered from a physiological shift. Why couldn't the near-death experience be part of that biochemical shift that happens, but maybe is interrupted, and you pull back, your physiology goes back from near death to waking state? Why can't it be all of the above? Why would one necessarily discount it, other than those who want to say, no, that can't be, this is all there is, what you see is what you get, there is nothing more? Where do you come in on that?
I would say, Laura, you're right on this. It's that whole thing about oxygen deprivation to the brain, that goes back to the ancient Greeks too. That was Plato was very sympathetic to these near-death experiences, but Democritus, who came a little before Plato, had figured out just by thinking about it that, contrary to our sense impression that the tabletop before you is solid and unbroken, he realized it had to be made up of tiny little bits. They're too small to see, which he called atoms. And so from that, what Democritus wrote about this is there's no such thing as a moment of death. And he said these stories that people bring back from almost dying represent the residual biological activity of the body. And so but on philosophical grounds, I never bought that. But then there's another ground that I think, because what that is phenomenalism or epiphenomenalism, which is the idea that consciousness has no independent reality, but that it's a secondary byproduct or an illusion caused by the primary reality, which is, in their minds, the brain substance and the biochemical reactions in it. But when I was in medical school, I was already known for this research before I went to medical school. And so one of my professors took me aside very early on. She told me about an experience she had when she was trying to resuscitate her own mother. And my professor told me that as her mother died, she herself, my professor, got out of her body and saw her mother there in spirit form, saw her own body and her mother's body down below, saw this tunnel open up, and saw spirits of relatives and friends of her mother's emerging from it, and so on. So my professor was not ill or injured. There was no question of an oxygen deprivation to her brain. And yet she had the same experience. And these are very common, that bystanders at the bedside of the dying, who are not themselves ill or injured, nonetheless have all of the standard elements that we regard as a near-death experience. But again, this is not going to make that way of arguing go away, because it's there's a lot of people who enjoy talking about or debating about near-death experiences as a kind of hobby. And they're so addicted to that oxygen deprivation thing. You know, they're not going to give it up just because of reality. But in the real world, it's there's got to be some other factor or factors.
Yeah.
It's like neuroscience is wonderful and I love it, but the narratology is a lot better thing to study if you're going to think about near-death experiences than neuroscience is.
I really appreciate how all your training and philosophy have come to bear to lay the foundation for this, to build the bridge of logic and the rational and the good arguments that you present. So.
And actually, Raymond, Tony, who's here, is an astrophysicist. I think he wants to switch careers with you, so you can become the astrophysicist.
Hi, Tony. Yeah. Oh, listen, no. I'm still an astronomer at heart. Oh my God, it's just so amazing.
Tony, then.
Tony had a couple questions anyway. Tony, go ahead and turn on your mic and ask your questions.
Hi, Tony.
Okay. One of the questions that I've wondered about, and I've seen so many times that many people have died in my presence, but where they've been filled full of drugs. They're given morphine and other things. And I'm wondering if this is bypassing the experience. And I asked the question thinking, would I really like to, when I go without drugs, just even if there's pain, wouldn't it be an interesting ride?
Good question.
Well, from my experience, I kind of agree with what Jung said. Jung was interested in what we call near-death experiences too, and had one himself. And he had interviewed people who had, and he made the observation too that he actually thought that the drugs used kind of tended to block this experience. And that has been my observation in my own career of dealing with the terminally ill. It just seems that a lot of drugs on board tend to block this, not necessarily having the experience, but rather articulating it in some way. So personally, I don't want any pain, no pain. So I'm not afraid of death, but pain is not my thing. And but I think that clouding the consciousness during the dying process is not what I want for me.
Yeah.
Mm. Raymond, what do you think of ketamine? The research that's been done on ketamine, and because I've heard that that's supposed to be, they've done linguistic research, and did you read that in Bruce Grayson's book? They found that the way people describe ketamine correlated
It
most
correlates.
closely to the language of NDEs and
This
so
is what I've heard, and but I've talked with people who had ketamine, I've talked with people with near-death experiences, and I've talked with people who had both, right? And so, and this is not a controlled study or anything, it's just an observation. And that is that what people tell me is that, yeah, when I talk about my ketamine experience, I have to use similar terms as to when I talk about my near-death experience. But that's a linguistic thing, right? The quality of the experience was different. And that whereas the ketamine was a kind of, I guess, Plato would think on the way of images and all that. People say about near-death experiences very commonly that this was more real than real. And but I don't know, but just from the maybe 100 or so people I've talked with who had both near-death experiences and experiences with psychedelics, they all made essentially that same distinction, that there's a verbal necessity to use similar terms, but that in the experiencing of it, they experience the two states as different.
Tony, do you have another question? I know in the chat room you put up a couple other questions, but
Yeah, if you could indulge me, there's the experience while one's dying, but I've had in a couple of cases a profound experience of, I think, the person coming to me, and that there's a whole scene that's created about it. And if it's a coincidence, it would be remarkable. An example, I held my ex-wife's hand when she passed away, when they disconnected her from life support. I didn't go to her funeral. I went to a concert instead. And at the concert, it started out with Stairway to Heaven. And then I went into a piano piece she would play.
Yeah, Tony, this is, Tony, where I think this is headed is, I know I've studied in philosophy the concept of personal identity, right? Like, what is it that makes us the person we are? And, to go back historically, I guess the first big major point was Plato's theory that the personal identity consists of the immaterial, immortal soul, and that the body is a kind of illusion, right? And then that with Hobbes, that became intolerable, because Hobbes realized that doesn't make any sense. So then it became with Locke the idea that we are constituted by our personal memories. And then with Hume, it became, well, it's just an illusion, right? He said, whenever I look within what I most regard as most intimately me, I don't really see any substrate. I just see the passing impressions. But where I've come to it was through my career in geriatric psychiatry before I went into forensic psychiatry for a year. And I talked with some very articulate old people who's very insightful and all. They're there for situational stress or whatever. And a comment I heard constantly was, Raymond, the older I get, the more I feel when I look back on my life that it has been a kind of play or a script or a movie or a story, right? And this is a very common thing that old people realize. And, and so where I've come to is I think that your personal identity is your story, right? And that, and from that point of view, these coincidences that you're talking about, it's, they have more of a narrative or theatrical application than a physical application, right? And I mean, I've had some, just like just things that you cannot dismiss, that are part of your life story that don't make any sense within a physicalist concept.
I know what you mean, and I seem to receive a rich array of coincidences and things that would be impossible physically. And I almost think I could do some science on it, with Bayesian mathematics and Monte Carlo and stuff like that. But maybe I'll resist. Who knows?
Yeah, an ongoing
When
discussion.
I was in my logic course back in the long, long time ago, we were talking about how it's meaningless to make any assessments of the probability of a past event, right?
Yeah.
And I've realized in that class is the reason is that if you could make an assessment of the probability of a past event, then it's utterly impossible that you and I could be talking at this, because it's like, all right, you think of the sperm and egg thing going back to the Australopithecines that has to generate you and me, right? Here, I mean, that's incalculable odds.
Yeah.
So if you had to go back and calculate what the probability of us being here, there's no possibility that we're sitting here now having this conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, good point.
Well,
I appreciate that.
So it's real.
Thank you, Tony.
Yeah, thank you, Tony.
I was going to say,
Yeah,
Tony,
good questions and
yeah, we
comments.
appreciate the fact that scientists have emotions too, right? They're still human.
We appreciate when top scientists can be mystics. Yeah.
Thank you. Christine, would you like to ask a question?
Happy Mother's Day, everyone. Lisa and Raymond, thank you so much for talking to us today. I actually teach a class at the University of Missouri called Souls and Spirits, a Cross-Cultural Analysis of the Supernatural. So, Raymond, I have my students read a couple of your clips from your book. I also have them read Bruce Grayson's work and many other people, at least for a 2-week section. I don't spend a lot of time on this, but one of my grad students is also in the room, and we really have enjoyed the near-death experiences and discussions.
Thank you.
I ordered your new book on nonsense a few minutes ago on my Kindle. And so I was just thinking that would make such a wonderful seminar for people at Mizzou. So I'm looking forward to reading that.
Oh, great. Yeah. Let me know what you think about it, because it's my life's work. I just, this is what I realized when I was 12 years old, was when I had this idea of the different types of nonsense. And that's kind of been all the other things is, what appealed to me about astronomy was the utter unintelligibility of it.
Right. I do have a question or maybe a concept, and of course I've not read your book, but I'm just listening to what you've said today. But it seems to me what's remarkable about us humans is the ability to have what you might call nonsense or intelligible discussions somehow click with us, and we can make it completely understandable. And that's really, I think, as unintelligibility is a fascinating and nonsensical thought, but I would say that what is really powerful is when it makes sense to us, that we can understand the nonsense.
Yes. And I'm sorry to go on like this, but I've
No,
got
I
to
love
tell you
it.
a story.
I guess I would like to
tell
hear
you a story.
that.
My son Carter that I introduced you to early on. Carter is now 22, and we adopted Carter at birth. He's Mexican-American by heritage, and he was born in Kerrville, Texas. He was born in July 20th, 1998. We had been down the previous April to make acquaintance with his birth mother and her parents. So Carter was born on July 20th, and then my wife was the first person to hold him. The obstetrician just delivered him and gave him over to Cheryl. He's been with us ever since. So on the baby stays in the hospital for 3 days, and when Carter was discharged on the 3rd day, we all went together with Carter's birth mother and her parents, and Cheryl, my wife, and Carter in his little baby seat, and me. And we went to a local restaurant there in Kerrville, Texas. And so the gist of the conversation was that Carter will always know about his birth parents and his birth family. And then in the fullness of time, we'll all get together again. And in the midst of this, I looked up and there was a nonsense placard on the wall of the restaurant, which said, "Closed. I have gone out to find myself. If I should arrive before I return, please hold me till I come back." And that's exactly what you're talking about, right? That's nonsense. But in the context, that was exactly what was going on. And then at 11 years later, the whole family came and stayed a week with us. And, you know, Carter still keeps in touch with his birth family. So
I think when those conduits are open, right, between us and the spirits or us and the whatever the all is, you can even just turn on the radio and some phrase, totally out of context from what the narrator is meaning, somehow has meaning to you. Or you flip open a book, or you look at a sign or whatever, that the messages come to you. Maybe it's like the I Ching, that you can really flip on any of the hexagrams, any of the sentences that are their meaning, and you put it together and a new insight emerges because you've expanded your boundaries. It seems like that. It seems like we are in dialogue with the universe if we open our ears and our hearts and our minds to it. That it's always talking to us. I think that's the goal here.
the ancient Greeks had a mode of divination called Cledon. And what a Cledon was, you would go to, they had an oracle, various oracles, and the idea was you would go into there was one of them in one of the Greek cities in Egypt, the Oracle of Apis, I think it was.
Yeah.
And it consisted of a sanctuary where you went to consult the god or goddess. And then on the outside of the temple, there was this courtyard where people brought their local toddlers, kind of a playground for toddlers. And so there were benches all around the playground. So what you would do is you would go into the sanctuary and you would write your question on a piece of paper and put it on the temple altar. And then you would put your fingers in your ears and you would go out and sit on a bench in the courtyard, and then you unplug your ears and you would hear your answer in the talk of the toddlers. And by the way, I've tried it. It works.
That was my second interview with you. You were the one that looked at the Greek divination methods, something about water, looking in water or looking in a mirror. And then you're kind of triggering your mind to see connections. You're putting yourself in a bit of a trance state for messages to come through. So it seems like we need to be a little bit over in that direction for the spirits or the wisdom or whatever you want to call it, however you define it, to kind of merge with us. We need to expand our boundaries to reach halfway to open that flow, it seems. That would be my mythopoetic way.
I agree. And I think it's, you know, to cope with the afterlife question, Hume was absolutely right when he said that the mind we have and the logic we have are not adequate for proving an afterlife. He was absolutely right, but he was wrong in his assessment that it's impossible to do that. I say that it's a lot easier than we imagine to alter our mind and our logic in such a way that we can think logically about life after death.
Yep, expand our boundaries. Wow.
Christine, did you have another question or comment?
Christine, you and I talked about how the near-death experience looks different, you point out, in different cultures. I was wondering what you had to say about that, any of you.
I have a really good friend by the name of Chris Kerr. He was a professor at ASU in anthropology. He's now retired, but he looked at different near-death experiences. He looked at cross-culturally and found that some of the Asian groups, they don't really, because they're doing so much meditation and they're highly trained, they're not seeing the tunnels or they're not perceiving spirits the same way as we do. So I always find it fascinating how what we do understand about the other realm is still based on our cultural knowledge and what we're expected to see. Right. I'm a fan of also Bruce Grayson's work, which I think Lisa just mentioned. But one thing I like is his Pekindarian, and that, you know, some things happen that we're not expecting from culture or from our own knowledge, what people exist. So I find that really fascinating. What are your thoughts on that? Either one of you.
Well, I've talked with a lot of people from different cultures. I think that a big factor in it is linguistics as well. It's like, in a general rule, people say that, you know, I don't have any words for this, but I'm forced to draw images from my own culture, but that still doesn't get it. I like Hollowell's article from the 30s, I think it was.
Yeah, Pete Hollowell,
Yeah.
Irving. Yeah, he's
Or
my
is
yes.
I
He did
thought
a Ojibwa. Yeah,
among he was the Salto Indians of Canada, right? And he
yeah, the Ojibwa.
Mhm, yeah.
Absolutely.
What
And
did he say?
he's the person that when I did my discussion on animism, I talked about other than human beings and how they define spirit in different types of ways. So we've talked about that. But yeah, the thought is that there's consciousness and volition. Some rocks, not all rocks, but some rocks can have volition and knowledge and can share its consciousness with a person. I find that very powerful. But most of us in this room that do the Cuyamonga stuff are mystics. So we have the sensibility. Sometimes I actually have my students sometimes ask me about trees because trees speak to me, and I tell them, yeah, they speak to me, but not in English. And this is one of your non-intelligible categories, that you get an emotional sensibility or a knowledge base that comes through to you if you think and meditate. So the Apache in New Mexico and Arizona, they do a lot of their contemplation and sitting at the base of the tree, and that tree in a sense speaks to them, but probably not even in Athabascan, which is their traditional language, but it's a sense of knowledge. And I love the linguistic stuff. It's a big secret, but I used to teach anthropology of linguistics at Mizzou for a couple of years. So yeah, but there are things that come through that is totally understandable, but not in your own native tongue. Absolutely. So Lisa, I'm looking forward to reading some of your work, and I love the poetry you shared for your mom today. Thank you so much for doing that. It's one of my friends on here observed it's an emotional day for many of us. So right. Yeah, thinking about all this with Mother's Day, and many of us are old enough to have lost our mothers for a while, and many of us have had dreams, our vision, our knowledge of, people that have gone before us to the other realm. So I'm looking forward to reading more of your work too.
Thank you.
What a nice, wonderful explanation on Raymond's work, which I was so excited that you're both here.
I wanted to make one comment. Right now, I'm working with several psychic mediums and talking about them, about how they deal with symbols, right? And so there's 6 of them, and what they all have shared with me is that they have their own lexicography, right? Because one psychic might see an apple and it means danger, or poison. Another might see an apple and it means being the favorite in your family or something. And each psychic had their own sort of symbolic vocabulary, and that to be a really high level psychic or medium, they really know what their own symbolism is and what their own lexicography is. So just something that she said reminded me a little bit about how when you're sitting with the tree, or when you're sitting anywhere, the kind of language you're getting, we have the consensual literal language, which we all agree upon, but then we each have our own sort of internal symbolism. Well, we know this through dreams, right? And the psychics that I'm doing research with have said to me that they've only been able to become reliable and accurate in what they do once they really understand their own internal symbolism. So
we say download. I am getting the download. It can be emotional. It can be just direct knowing. In the knowing, it can be words. It can be a shift. It's just like an energy. Oh, it's all full of energy. Just the download is that word that we tend to.
And what blue might mean to you might be different for me, right? So a ribbon to you might be different for a ribbon to me. And that's like the realm of nonsense, because in literal language, blue is the same meaning, or we might share. But once meanings begin to diverge, you're going into another dimension, or you're going into another way of thinking about the world.
We're back to metaphor, like the Navajo code talkers. Their language was indecipherable to the Germans because they were using objects that they knew and their native words for it. This is like this. This mountain is like the turtle. This is, those wonderful metaphors. So I think for me, this mythopoetic language of symbol and metaphor and art is so at our core. It's the language our soul speaks. It's the language that spirit speaks. That's the language that comes through us. And then we have to find words for our consensual, literal language to translate it. So we are translating that while we're having these experiences in the journaling. That's why we say, Don't try to put words to it. Don't put the intellect, park the intellect off to the side when you're letting this other muscle of your being, your soul speak. Experience it directly. Later, when you're journaling, that's the time to put words to it. Don't try to rip it apart. Tell the intellect, just be over here. Just hang out here. Be a witness. So I'm understanding more of that topography, as you put it, for that trance state. This has been so helpful on so many levels. Did not expect to go here with you. This has just been fascinating. Thank you. Paul, you have a story to share.
Oh, I'm coming back to Tony's concept of synchronicity. When Laura's mother was going towards the end of her life, she would always say to me, Paul, I want you to learn how to play, because I play piano. I want you to learn how to play Unforgettable. She loved that song. And I'd say, Bernice, that's not really there's so many talented pianists out there that can play this kind of music. It's not really my forte, but I'll do my best. So when we passed, I just played a recording.
For our little celebration.
Right. But a year after her passing, we coordinated with Laura's sister, Kim, and we said, let's get together and light a candle. And what time? 3:00 p.m. We'll get together, we'll light a candle, and we'll honor Bernice.
It was on the anniversary of her death.
That's what I said, yeah. So I was in the vehicle on the way back, rushing to get to the house to do this candle ceremony at 2:55. I turned on the radio at some random radio station. Unforgettable comes on as soon as I turn the radio on. The entire song plays, which is not a typical song you hear on the radio nowadays. It's just not that common to be in a playlist. And I was just like chills, blown away, couldn't believe it. Pulled out my phone and recorded it to share with families. Like, Bernice wants Unforgettable played, so we're going to have to play Unforgettable.
You had not just Kim, but all the other two siblings. Too,
Right.
Jude and Alex.
Right, yeah. So anyway,
wow.
Another one of those synchronicities, Tony, that we experience.
So my father, Lester, had a special omelet pan. His thing on Sundays was come home from the gym. He worked out, did the track, did the swim, the whole thing. Come home. This was, till the end of his life he did this. Come home from the gym and he wanted to make this big breakfast for everybody, omelets. Had a special pan. Nobody could touch this pan in the household. It was his pan. You were not allowed to touch it. Special pan. Kim got it because Kim is the gourmet cook. And so Kim brought it home, and she's having this tearful time of remembering Lester and taking the pan and seasoning it and introducing it to her kitchen and giving it an honored place. Her radio was already on. Her radio on its own, she did not touch the dials, turns to KJR, which was my father owned the station for many, many years. And then the jingle, KJR, Seattle, Channel 95. It played that, and it just, she didn't know it was KJR because she didn't tune it to that station. He'd long sold it. So the jingle came, and she's like, oh, hi, Dad, you're here. So these kinds of incidences in waking life that you go, hi there, thank you. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I hadn't, when I started the final words work, I hadn't anticipated doing anything with after-death communication. I mean, it wasn't part of my, it just wasn't part of my intention. But so many people said to me, oh my God, after my loved one died, these things began to happen, involving all the kinds of synchronicities we're talking about. And, so I have a chapter in my book now about it because it was so prevalent. Yeah. And, how do we explain it? It seems very real to me and very prevalent.
How do we explain it? Yeah.
We have a couple hands up to ask questions.
Let's hear some stories.
Cam is first, and then Carolyn. So Cam, you want to go ahead and turn on your mic?
Thanks, Dr. Raymond, for coming out. I appreciate hearing you talk. I really liked to hear what you had to say, both you and Lisa. I made the mistake early in my career as well to do my undergrad in philosophy. Horrible, terrible mistake. And I feel your trauma, and I understand what you went through, sir. I really do. So, and one of the things that I was inducted with was the guy who taught the course, who was my advisor, was really into Monty Python. All right. He was extremely into Monty Python, and one of the things he talked about is the nonsensical aspects that you run into in logistical systems if you take them to their extremes. All right, and Monty Python definitely loved playing on those jokes. You know what I'm talking about? You understand what I'm saying? And of course, you see the same thing in the Principal Discordia. You see the same thing, Kevin Thornley, Robert Anton Wilson, that type of thing. I see the humor gets really embedded in what we're talking about, all right, in that aspect, the nonsensical. Can you speak to that at all in as far as how you see things? Because in my mind, I'm also a former cop and former law enforcement, a former law enforcement officer and former military member. Humor is probably the most important aspect that I can view as far as these types of things are concerned. And if you ever been around a cop or a person who's a former law enforcement officer, you know the humor gets dark pretty quick. All right, it's a very dark.
Yeah.
Yes.
Survival mechanism,
Well,
I think.
Cam, I'm from a law enforcement family.
Okay, there we go. Then you know
Yeah,
exactly what I'm talking about.
my uncle Fairley, two uncles, one cousin, and a brother, and then I was a forensic psychiatrist too. So,
Ah,
and all the I got to know a lot of homicide detectives who are the smartest people in the world, actually, because their knowledge is, their lives are dependent on knowing a lot of stuff. And so, what I would say about the humor is that I think the reason why the afterlife question brings up humor is that it's a matter of how you think about discourse, and that is that comedy is the mode of discourse that portrays a happy ending, whereas tragedy ends in death. Okay. And so by definition, what happier ending could there be for most people anyway than that there's a life after death. So discourse about life after death is by definition comical in its structure because it portrays a happy ending. But more than that, it's metacomical in nature because it goes up and it absorbs the end of tragedy, which is death inside itself. So I think that movie Beetlejuice very beautifully portrayed that. It was a comedy about death, and then at the end, the comedy often ends in a marriage, and in the end of Beetlejuice, there was the marriage between the living and the dead. Yeah, so absolutely, and I think as I've thought about it over the years, I was a comedian for a while, and I do. It's I think there's a sort of inherent connection that between discourse about life after death and humor.
Yeah, I've come to find that's the closest I can reach intellectually with you in the aspect of talking about it from the perspective of humor. Because I look back at I've studied Lewis Carroll, and I one of the favorite things that my again my advisor back then was talking about is the logistical aspects he embedded into the stories and all the things going with it, the nonsensical. You know what I'm talking about. And but for me anyway, you trying to get past the nihilistic aspects of death itself and looking at it through some aspects of humor, all right, and that to basically take on that issue in your own mind, and it is nonsensical because you have to laugh at the madness to some extent, all right, and that's it's specifically talking about it from the perspective of a cops, talking about the perspective of someone who was a detective and now also in the past also a member of the military. Yeah, the humor gets dark, but you have to be able to confront that somehow. All right, the language of humor climbs deeply in there. All right. By the way, I'm also student of Dr. Chris, and my focus of my work has been near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, and things of that nature as well too. So these are things that very much interest me. All right, and I think that the more I study Native Americans in the aspect of these types of things, all right, the more I keep running the same aspect is that there's the humor. I start finding the humor embedded into the subject, right? And that's how they're confronting the chaos in many ways is laughing at it.
It's a good antidote, isn't it?
I mean, you
At
can
the,
speak to that if you wish. I appreciate hear what you have to say.
Thank
at the forensic
You
unit,
are one
we had,
interesting guy, Cam, I have to say.
yeah, you are, Kim. I just,
Yeah.
when I worked in the forensic unit with the criminally insane was what I did. And we, you know, during one day, we may have, on days where we presented all the cases, we may had to present 15 different horrible, ghastly homicides in a day, you know, like the things that you read about in the National Enquirer. And so how did we deal with that? As people used to ask us, it's like, how do you stand that? And I said, well, we laugh a lot.
Exactly.
And you know, you
Exactly.
do. I mean, it sounds so bizarre, but you can laugh or you can cry. And you know, it was just we always thought it was just, people would ask us, why do you do that? Aren't you scared? And we would say, well, I guess I'm scared, but I don't notice it because I'm so curious about this, right? Your curiosity overwhelms the fear factor. You go into it knowing that you're going to get assaulted, which happened to me twice. But it's the curiosity overwhelms you. And one of the things you do is because there is, as you've noted yourself, talking about homicide, I used to talk to a lot of people who committed homicide. The judges would ask me to see him because, you know, they knew this guy all his life. He was the deacon in the Baptist church, the owner of the car dealership, the respect, and he, you know, he hires his psychopath brother to kill his inconvenient girlfriend. So the judge just told me, it's like, Raymond, there's got to be something wrong here. I mean, isn't there a screw loose somewhere? So I interviewed the guy and I said, no, Judge, there's not a screw loose. I mean, this guy is sane, but, you know, it's because what the mistake people make who think of homicide is that they think the cops are dumb, which is the most, and when you're interviewing, you can't, you know, we all had to develop a technique for keeping ourselves from laughing out loud. You know, mine was to bite the inside of my cheek, and had a friend who would shake his leg very hard. Right? Because, you know, when they tell you these plots in their mind, how they came to this decision to kill, I mean, it's horrible and yet it's funny.
It's what hilarious is the reasons they come up with in their heads occasionally.
Yes.
Yes. Go, okay, this is what you were thinking, you know what I mean? You got, you burnt your toast this time. This one last time you snapped, you know what I mean? Going back to one last thing and I'm just want to bring up Tony Hull real quickly. One of the things that and the reason I brought this up, all right, and I wanted to specifically talk to you about Raymond as well, is that yeah, today is a hard day. I lost my mother a couple years ago, and it's still something that I've been dealing with now for quite a while. It happened right in the middle of my grad school time frame, and it's something that luckily I had good people around me like Dr. Chris and Dr. Todd that helped me out quite a bit dealing with those issues, because I lost pretty much my entire family in the last few years. But anyway, make a long story short, one of the things that got me through the chaos of those events was humor. It was the aspect of being able to look back in time and think of the funnier, more nonsensical, crazier things that my mother would do on a day-to-day basis that drove me batshit insane occasionally, all right? And to think about that in that aspect, and that's the moments that she's closest to me. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
Does that dovetail into your work to what I'm talking about?
Absolutely. I mean, I just think, you know, humor is, I think there's,
Thank you, Karen.
one of the great mysteries of the mind is humor. I do think it's, you know, how in the name of God does humor work? And I mean, it is just, it's so wonderful. I mean, when I was a comedian, it's so indescribable. It's like that when the audience gets laughing really hard, you get that, it's like a beat or vibration in your chest. But laughter just hits you right here, and it just it's
Oxytocin.
wonderful.
Yeah.
One of my favorite titles of Raymond's book is Laugh After Laugh, right?
Yeah,
Oh,
that's right. I wrote it in, and I've also written a book about the illnesses of the afterlife, like holy scoliosis, like is the worst public health problem in the afterlife. And it comes from just sitting around those big mansions all the time and never getting any exercise except to waddle over to the buffet of eternity a couple of times a day, that they become holy slobs. Or there's dislocated halo. It's in the head. Or the most annoying illness of the afterlife is phantom genital syndrome. They say that they feel they're all the way out of their body except for that one part. And so, I mean, I agree with Cam on this, that, there's an intrinsic connection between the humorous mode of thinking and the way we have to think about life after death.
Gallows humor.
There's that whole
It's also one step away. It's like we go meta when we laugh at something. We don't take it so seriously. It's like it's one step removed. I think it's a very high state of consciousness, actually.
I think it's a healing mechanism.
I want to die laughing.
Amen. I want to die laughing too. Yeah. Matter of fact, can I tell a quick story about my mother? Can I indulge you?
Yeah, go ahead. Indulge us with your
Okay,
mother.
So my mom has been struggling with this fatal illness, and they gave her 2 months. But my mother's always had a very light heart. So she was talking to the doctor, and he was saying, this is a really, you're a very sick woman, Mrs. Felix. And she said, tell my boyfriend that, and she was like joking with him. And so he was very upset because she thought, how could a woman be so lighthearted about her own death? She must be incompetent, mentally incompetent, or have dementia. So they sent this social worker over to test her to see. She got 100%. She was just fine, totally competent. And he couldn't believe that she could be lighthearted. And again, not to trivialize the seriousness of what's going on, but it's what's enabling her to go through the process with a light heart. And it's making it easier for her, So anyway.
Like Oscar Wilde, either the wallpaper goes or I do.
Amen. That's right.
I'm going to go to Carolyn next. And then after that, Sharon, Carolyn, and enough Jackson also. But there you are. Hi, Carolyn.
Hey, Carolyn.
Turn on your mic.
Hello.
Hi, Carolyn.
Thank you too. This has been so wonderful and so dear to my heart, this whole discussion. And it's just escaping me. I'm just so thankful to have you two here. Also tell you a little story too about my mother and myself. And I'm laughing to myself. I'm laughing with my son here because Raymond, as you were telling the story about looking up in the sky and knowing that it goes on forever, and that's what I used to do. But then you took everything quite a step further and, analyzed it and made it your life's work. And where I just all my life has just believed, I just believe that we're here, the spirits are here, it goes on forever. All just knew it. And, but so my mom died right before I was 15 years old. And I did not get a chance to hear any last words. It was very sudden. I was with her. I didn't see anything, but I just knew that, it was okay. And that's how I was raised in the synagogue. And, it was all very spiritual. And, I just know that my mother's here with me. About a year after that, she came and woke me up in my bed and we had a talk. And that was the year before your book came out, Raymond. And I just want to thank you because that was so important to me when your book came out. Just to know that it's I had never realized that it might be a universal thing and that it's true. You're famous, you're writing about it, you're talking about it forever, forever, you're in my consciousness. So I just really wanted to thank you for that. And
A meaningful
Thank you so much,
confirmation.
Yeah.
it was amazing.
so
It was like a year after she passed. And a
Jackson,
little,
we have to say hello to you too.
Hi, Jackson.
Hey,
Hi, Jack.
we missed you.
Good to see
But
you.
I have had many, many, experiences with my mother, other relatives.
Mm.
I saw Laura's mother reunion after she passed. Laura, I don't remember.
That story. Yes.
Yeah. I woke up and I knew that it was Laura's mom, and I could see the whole reunion. They
Mm.
were all in her. It was so beautiful.
It meant a lot to me, Carolyn, that you shared.
Yeah, thank you, sweetheart. That's
And
beautiful.
it's just, my point is that the consciousness, we're all part of the consciousness. So I've never even met Laura's mother, but because of the 6 degrees of separation,
Mm-hmm.
I felt it, and I was able to share with Laura, and it was beautiful, beautiful, beautiful.
Oh, thank you, Carolyn. You're,
So much
Yeah.
for this.
See, some
day.
people just have that. I call it a superpower. Some people just have that. They just,
Yeah.
you just that, yeah.
Oh, the superpower. Oh, and I've been at CI, I've been at Cuyamonga, and I never opened my eyes during trance. But one time I felt so called to do that, and I peeked one eye open, and there was a beautiful white light surrounding Paul.
Oh, wow. Mm.
So, yes.
thank you, Carolyn. That's
Great.
That's such a cool mom you have there, Jackson.
yeah.
Wow.
Blessings to you
Yeah.
both. Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll go to Sharon Rose. You're up next. I'll pop you up on the screen. There you go.
Hey, Sharon.
Hello. Dr. Moody's work has gotten me through some very intense times in the past, and this is a real blessing to be able to say hello.
Thank you so much.
And I'm quite fascinated with this idea of the afterlife establishment. I started to kind of channel a play after Christopher Hitchens died, and that play has a little scene about the real estate agents on the other side. So when you spoke about,
excuse me.
I was just going to say, when you spoke of the afterlife establishment, it reminded me of that, and that parapsychology seems to have its territory marked out. So I'm quite curious
That's
about
right.
that.
Exactly. Well, Sharon, I think that what I meant by the afterlife establishment is it's the group of parapsychology types. And these are my dear friends, by the way. This is not personal, right? And these are things I say to them. It's like the primary assumption they make that creates the problem that why they can't make any progress is scientism, right? It's like, and the reality is that rational investigation does not begin with those psychic researchers who were scientists back in the 1890s. The origin of the rational inquiry into the afterlife was with Plato. And it's too bad that they haven't read the Phaedo, because they would see what's wrong with their whole method. But basically, it's life after death is still a philosophical question. But that there's people love that word science, and they think they're paying a compliment to the question of an afterlife by saying that it's scientific, by making a false assertion, because it's not scientific. It's still a conceptual question.
I can't wait until science and the larger sphere joins medicine. For example, Western medicine and the alternative medicine make a better complete system. So why not science and the beyond? It makes a better system.
Right.
Everything's got its place, is what I'm trying to say. So, yeah.
And actually, I was researching for today's discussion, Dr. Moody, and I came across a Professor Gregory Shushan. I don't know if you know him, if he's a colleague of yours, but he's a religious studies professor in England, and he wrote a book, Near-Death Experiences in Indigenous Religions. And I've sent
good, interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I sent him an email like, "Come join us for a discussion. Want to follow up on Dr. Moody's work?" And but that would be interesting to look back into history.
We've written,
Yeah,
And Lisa, I wish you both would come back sometime again because
Yeah.
we've just scratched the surface.
Thank you,
Lisa, I
Sharon.
want you to tell us about your Final Words project where you are inviting people to upload their stories. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah.
Yes, I have a website, finalwordsproject.org. And gosh, I wish I just brought out some of the new data this morning, and it's so exciting to go through it. But yeah, finalwordsproject.org, and it's a great resource too. We have a lot of free materials and information. And for those of you who'd like to share accounts of Final Words, I would really appreciate it. I've been invited to work with Dr. Christopher Kerr. I don't know if any of you are familiar with him. They're on the Center for Hospice and Palliative Care in Buffalo, New York, and they've done some of the most extensive research in deathbed visitations and more. And I'm really excited. I'm kind of feeling a second wind with the Final Words work right now. So bring on those accounts if you have them. I would be so grateful. Raymond would be grateful.
And your book is titled Words on the Threshold, is it?
Yeah, Words at the Threshold.
Words at the Threshold. And thank you so much, Lisa, for this time with you today. And Raymond, oh boy. So we are to read all of your books, especially your book on nonsense. I am going to read that with such interest.
And let me know what you think about it, because really, I just, it's my life's work, actually. But to me, the near-death experience thing is a sort of corollary of what I've been most interested in my life is unintelligibility, and unintelligibility itself, paradoxically, is an intelligible phenomenon.
Well, this is not something that most people have ever addressed, that I've ever heard of, so this is new turf, and I really appreciate your out-of-the-box thinking and lending new insight into something that is so foundational to us. We're not seeing it, the forest for the trees, but you've just put a beam on it, and we really need to look at the anthropology of ourself and our worldview. And this is a big piece of that. Both of you have looked at this, putting the linguistics to this and opening a bridge. I'm all about the bridges. How do we cross to the other side? You've built such a sturdy bridge for this.
Well, paradoxically, the subtitle of my book, Making Sense of Nonsense, is a logical bridge between science and spirituality.
There we go. Thank you for that.
That works.
Yes. Yeah.
And we've been looking hard and long for a stand-up comedian for our program, and I think you're hired. Thank you so much, both of you. It's the heartfelt dedication to this research is felt, and we're so appreciative of you taking time today to share your research. And of course, as Laura said, we'd love to talk more in the future.
Well, to validate our experience, I think that we and science needs to open it up so that we are the scientists out there reporting from the trenches, from life. We are the explorers pushing the seams of the envelope, what we bring back, the anomalies are the red flags to say, look here, something's going on here. Those sense at the back of the mind, it may look nonsensical to our Western thinking, but our indigenous ancestors going way, way back had a far wider spectrum for understanding life and embracing it, and all that our mental capacity can afford us and bring us. So I think we need to just stretch ourselves to fully embrace all of this, and it would become more sensible to our ears and our eyes and our hearts and our souls. So thank you for leading the charge on this realm.
Thank you all for listening. It's really great to meet everyone.